And then I went to the Telegraph as the chief leader writer, and I was at the Spectator for a while. So I've done journalism, and then I went into politics, and so I ran the central office of the Conservative Party for 3 years, including the 1997 general election, which was the biggest and most expensive election battle probably ever in this country, because as a result of what we did in that election, they made a law saying you couldn't spend so much money in future. So it was rather like the First World War. It was, everything was thrown. It was a war of attrition. Vast sums of money were spent. And the result for the Conservative Party, for the election I was in charge of, it was the worst result since 1832. So there, you have to be slightly humble about these things. And in a sense, that's a good point, because what you do in a political party is roughly what most other people try and do. You try and persuade people to do something or to believe something. Sorry? You need to persuade people or do something or believe something that they didn't know that they believed or that they wanted to do. So you have your policies, you work them out, you go to advertising agencies, you do all the rest of it. And the skills are, useful. They translate quite easily. And in particular, the relationship between politicians and the press, which is quite a subtle one, quite a blunt one as well. But at different times, politicians take the upper hand. They did when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, and before he became Prime Minister, Alistair Campbell, who ran his press office, just rationed things to the press. The press, who'd been used to being treated like, the princess in the room, suddenly became the pauper. They had to beg for things. And this relationship works both ways. Both parts need each other. And there isn't a natural balance in this. Anyway, so Philip said a little earlier that Mike had told you the inspirational stuff in this. It's very, very wonderful. And all of us, we were talking about Tim Montgomery at lunch, and Tim Montgomery also started out on his career attending one of Mike's talks, Bible talks, years and years ago. And he came to the meeting that Mike does every year, a couple of years ago, and said this and paid gracious tribute to him. So, it'll take you 10 years, Philip said, I think, to put what you know into some sort of practice, and I thought that was quite modest, actually, but we'll start from there. So in this session, we're talking about the art of communication, and I've been asked to give you a sense of the importance of good communication and the need to adapt and tailor whatever it is you wish to say or message to the content and circumstances relating to the issues. And we'll be having a look at, based on our experience at the Relationships Foundation, of how different methods and means can be used to communicate with different audiences. That's fundamentally what I'm doing. We'll also look at how to define your position for the maximum impact. And each of these slides is intended just to draw a more general lesson from work we have done in the recent past. So it's not just a matter of doing some research and putting together a press release and whacking it out. It's a whole picture of things that we do and which we think probably has the best chance of success. But it's worth stressing at this moment, and this will come up over and over again if I let it, that we're all undergoing tremendous change in the way the contemporary world communicates with each other, how it engages with each other, and we're just in the beginnings of this. And some of the young people which we are trying to deal with are just simply have not been on our radar for some years. And Catherine Barker, who's going to speak later on about the Family Stability Project and the work of Farson and what have you, is it very much is something we wanted to do, we wanted to be involved in, because it is largely unknown territory to us. And when you speak to young people, they don't read newspapers, they don't watch the news, they don't communicate in any of the ways that we are used to. And if you don't go to where they are, you won't talk to them. So, and it's infecting everyone. Even Michael Schluter has an iPhone. Who would have thought it? It's just remarkable. So, can you use it still? iPhone 6. Oh, that's fine. Good. I must keep one jump ahead of him, whatever else you do. But 5 years ago it would have been unimaginable. So so I'm the executive director of the Relationships Foundation. John Ashcroft, who's sitting over there, has been with the organisation for as long as anybody in the room, and almost as long as Michael Schluter, it has to be said, and has done most of the writing that has been done over the years, and does most of our thinking and writing. So His session later on will be about the thought that goes into this and the policies that we construct and the way we try and engage in argument and in debate and in discussion, and often very subtly, and it's a wonderful thing to hear. But I'm going to do the more basic communication tools, and if I knew how to do this. Oh, Philip, it was working earlier. What do I do? What have I done wrong? I'm pushing every button.
That's the other way.
What am I talking to? We did a dress rehearsal.
We did.
That's part of one's communication skills.
Okay, go ahead. I'll just do that this way.
Oh, okay, right, there we go. So, you were hearing from Mike about the biblical roots of the activities, and this was put together, and again, John Ashcroft wrote it many years ago, and you will notice the second person from the left is John Ashcroft. There he is. See? He's been here that long. And I know 3 of those people. And so John was working for the Jubilee Centre at the time, and they thought to themselves, political Christians in a plural society, how can we have a strategy for a biblical contribution? The Jubilee Policy Group came up with this, that the Relationships Foundation's core belief is that public policy should be debated and changed in a way that puts people in their relationships first. Its focus on changing the vision, language and goals provided through research initiatives, dissemination and partnerships with others to achieve common goals. I promise I won't read any more of the slides out like that. That essentially was, the idea was that it should be a bridgehead organisation, that it should take the work that Dr. Schluter had already done. It comes out of the Jubilee stable. It was established in 1993, finally, as a result of this preliminary work, as an independent think tank, thank you very much for a better connected society. So although it has these biblical roots, it is bridgehead in the sense that it deals with some issues, but issues that you can deal with the rest of the world in a perfectly normal academic way, peer-reviewed papers or whatever it is that you have to do in order to get other people's attention and get them to sit in the room. And we've deliberately followed various strands of work, originally because you could do almost anything. Mike has done things with prisons and the legal system, he's done things with hospitals, he's done things in schools, and we'll come back to some of those in a minute. But fundamentally, the strand of work we've been trying to do for the last 8-10 years, perhaps even, he began with well-being, and then we went into the testing of social policy. We came through to triple testing of all policy being done on economic grounds, on environmental grounds, on social grounds. And then we came down to something called the family test, which we persuaded, with others, we persuaded the government that they should do this. And until David Cameron left, we thought there was a running chance. It was, in fact, government policy that every policy, every bit of new legislation should be tested for its effect on families, and we hadn't quite really defined what that was. We were working on it with the civil servants, and John was doing this. So that was the main stream of work we were doing, and that is very characteristic of what RF does. Unlike Jubilee Centre, we've kept away from the key moral issues of our day. We don't do sex, we don't do beginning of life, we don't do end of life. We've helped start a marriage foundation, but if you want to know about marriage and why it's the best form of social organisation for bringing up children, and there are endless figures. In fact, the figures are so overwhelmingly in favour of it. It's embarrassing, really. But it takes a lot to persuade people this is the case, and particularly it's deeply better for the children than cohabitation in particular. And all the figures scream this at you. That's fine. But if you want to know, the biblical reasons for getting married, if we send you to Jonathan, so the Jubilee Centre, and they will tell you that. And Keep Sunday Special, a campaign we run as well. We argue it entirely on secular grounds, on the grounds of families and communities and what have you. If you want to know what the good Lord's view on Sunday is, again, I wouldn't begin to know how to explain this, but we send you off to Jonathan, because there are lots of people who can do that very well. So we are all engaged, and so sorry, these are some of the campaigns we do. We still have Keep Sunday Special, and it works well. Testing the test is what we were doing most recently with RF's pure work, the family test, but I'll refer to that in a minute. The Marriage Foundation, we started with a judge, Sir Paul Coleridge, High Court judge in the Family Division, I heard him one day at the Mothers Union, and he was talking about wanting to start a marriage foundation. I went up to him afterwards. We know how to do things like that. We're a relationships foundation. And of course, our aims were almost entirely, he's a strong Baptist. And so we were able to get our heads together, and now it's just celebrated its 5th anniversary and has had tremendous success in the press. Status is the name of the is the campaign which belongs to the Family Stability Network, which Catherine will speak about. Relational schools started by Mike, and when he retired earlier this year from his formal activities, I mean from office work as it were, he's not given up work, but we had started this with him, and we took full responsibility for it at the beginning of the year. And this is Rob, who's currently in either Australia or he may be on his way back, he may be in Singapore. And then the Racial Lens is the latest of a number of books. Mike referred to one or two of them this morning. He told you that one of them, our option, was available on the Relationships Foundation website to download free. I tried to do it, actually. I thought, I wasn't entirely sure I could do it, but next week, if you have a look, it'll be there, I promise you. But this is the latest of them, and this, again, John is the lead author of this project. And so we are, in a sense, we are very definitely carrying the flag. We're carrying the flag for Mike's passions and enthusiasms and the inspiration that he started in lots of people's lives in the secular arena, just as Jonathan does really in the more religious sector. But before we surge ahead, I just wanted to look back on a network which in a sense is the classic network for lots of us. Lots of us think of this when we think of social reform, how to build a network and change the world. That was also the caption on the slide we had earlier. And that's exactly what these people, the Clapham people, thought, the Clapham sect, the people who, in a sense, met in one church on one day, and they decided that they would try and change the conditions of life in this country, and had huge successes in all sorts of areas. Now, the temperature was very different then. It was good to be a Christian. You could stand up and say so, and Christians were expected to offer leads in all sorts of areas of life. And Mike spoke about this morning, so I don't mind saying this. I mean, there are moments when we're out in the field when we're very careful not to mention it. I mean, you do not need to be a Christian to work for us. Indeed, people have not been so. But broadly speaking, most people are sympathetic or know roughly where we're coming from. The only thing it says in our conditions, I mean our spec on the website, is that we come from Judeo-Christian roots, or whichever word we're using at the time. But we're quite frank about that. That's where we're coming from. Everyone's coming from somewhere. That's where we're coming from. And there have been moments where you could walk into a room and you see people look at you thinking, this is a pointy-headed nutter come into the room, and that's what Christians, in a sense, have to get used to. But we can almost always get around that. The last time it happened, by the end of the meeting, we were swapping anecdotes about how you do things and how you raise money from charities and all the rest, all the sort of things charities and think tanks talk about all the time, because they understood that our passion was very similar to theirs, maybe for different reasons, but you can plug into the same basic desire, the same basic intention, then you'll be fine. These people, they had the same problems we have, though, if you just take for granted for the moment that they were in a different religious background. They needed inspired leadership, and they were intensely practical. And I think this is the thing that I'm most struck whenever I think about them. They weren't just sort of semi-divines who wandered around the country doing good works. They really were an extremely hard-working bunch of people, but they had a very strong sense of leadership, and partly that was leadership for theological reasons. But in Wilberforce in particular, in the case of the Anti-Slavery League, they had a natural sense of authority, and he was a man who bore authority well. People around him, I looked them up. Sharp, who's the one, I think on the top left, he was a civil servant. He was a great pamphleteer. He wrote over 50 pamphlets. I suspect that may even be more than Michael Schluter's written. Macaulay, father of the great Macaulay, was a statistician, and he did all the organisation. He was a practical man. Buxton was a brewer. He was also an MP. Now, a brewer was a very, very wealthy man in the context of the time. He also founded the RSPCA, but that was a sort of sideline of his. And Clarkson travelled 10,000 miles And he activated a huge network of sympathetic anti-slavery societies. And in the end, he had to retire suffering from exhaustion. Now, I know a number of campaigns we have today which is almost exactly the same profile. You need someone who's got some money, you need someone who's good at organising, you need someone who's going to write, you need someone who's very good at talking, and you need someone in Parliament. You've got to work at Westminster, and you've got to work in the hedgerows and on the heaths and in the churches and in the chapels. And so the great lesson from these people, there are many great lessons, but one of the great lessons is, if you say, so should a social change campaign be top down or bottom up? And the answer is they have to always be both. You have to do both at the same time. They were top down from Parliament, and they were bottom up from the churches and from the local meetings and all the rest of it. At every stage, and at every stage, they showed in practical ways, through the numbers of organisations they started, they modelled the sort of social change they wanted to see and the sort of social engagement that they were prepared to get into. So if you come to one of our campaigns, Keep Sunday Special campaign, this was Michael Schluter's victory. There is Michael on the right. You see him there with some distinguished persons. I see an MP and a sports person, and I can't remember who the person on the left is, but and down here there's some very attractive advocates of keeping Sunday Special in there. You can date that probably to 86 from the fashions, possibly? I don't know. Mrs. Thatcher suffered her only serious defeat at second reading in a bill which Mike put together the coalition. And again, it was very similar. There were people who owned shops, people who owned a garden centre, people who owned a convenience store who supported him. There were people who did the organisation. It was a vast organisation. People who did the active communication, as it were, the letters, and organised meetings, and people went to it. And it was a fine piece of work. And it had its effect. And we repeated it 30 years later on the 30th anniversary. Last year, we had, actually, if you notice, the votes were 27 majority then, 31 now. We've gone up in parliamentary terms. We put together a majority position in the House of Commons to David Cameron's government, who tried to slip in effectively the deregulation of Sunday completely into a bill that was going through the House of Commons which had nothing to do with it. He tried to stop us having a fundamental conversation about it by putting it in after the report stage, after the committee stage and before the report, so it wasn't discussed at second reading. You didn't even have a conversation about what the principles were. It was extremely difficult in these circumstances to get the church to weigh in. But because, and Mike alluded to this earlier, because of the coalition that we have here, we managed to get the trade unions to work very hard on the Scottish MPs. And in Scotland, they don't have any restriction on Sunday trading. They have a sort of voluntary system that works very well. But so they didn't really have a national interest in this, but nevertheless, they came to the Westminster Parliament in order to vote down. I mean, chiefly because they saw an opportunity of defeating the government, which we encouraged them to think. The Labour Party was quite depressed at that time for reasons. They just lost an election in a way that was very damaging to them. And we managed to get the Labour Party, Christian Socialists and others who were very good at, they're called Red Christians now, Christians on the left, yeah. But Christian Socialists, I call them, and they're wonderful people. They're really good, but much smaller than they used to be, sadly. But they managed to inspire in the Labour Party a desire to see this as a social justice issue, which worked extremely well. And then there were 30 Tory rebels who the Tory party government was trying to pick off one by one. Only one of them bent, and then she recanted. And it was rather like, was it Latimer in the fire? You know, oh, no, I've changed my mind after all, you know. Oh, sorry, it was the other way around. I changed my mind, and then you stick your hand in the fire. It was like that. They only managed to wobble one person, and then only briefly, and these wonderful people led by David Burrows, great Member of Parliament, who very sadly lost his seat at the last election. They stuck to their guns, and they were defeated. And I think it was probably the only defeat in a bill, apart from something on pensions, that the Cameron government had. And it just shows how strong these brands, this is a real brand issue here. KSS is a brand, we don't run it nearly as tightly as we used to. It's a membership, but most of the members came from the 80s, and it's very difficult to find new members, and we keep thinking about how we might be able to do this. But the brand is strong enough. The government slightly quaked when they heard the Keep Sunday Special campaign was still around, and when we could present them with the The money came mainly from the businesses this time, small businesses, and the power of the trade unions, particularly politically, up in Scotland. And the government began to work out that they might lose this, and that's when they began to get very tough with their own people, thinking they could still just pull it round, because they had on paper they had a majority, but they didn't on the day. I thought we were going to win by 6 or something, so it was a very remarkable achievement. So that's, and we're working in similar ways with, and this helps, another point which I should make at some stage is this helps with the fundraising too, because a strong brand is much easier to fundraise for than just an idea you have. It's a profound truth that if you have a new idea, you can often go and find people who will give you money to start. Seed money is not, I mean, it's not easy, but it's the easiest sort of money for organisations like us to find. So the Marriage Foundation came along at a very good time for us when we were not doing very well financially, and we thought we'll give it a go. So we wrote mainly to our own supporters, historic supporters over the years, and said, we've got this new idea, what do you think? And they were extremely generous and kept the whole thing going for a couple of years. So, I mean, the same people will give for different reasons, but many of them will give to start things. And that, of course, makes it much more difficult to continue with some of these. So let me just talk about the first general point I want to make, which is that you need to have clarity in your content and in your presentation. This is a mood board. I don't know, Catherine, have you ever seen this mood board before? This is the mood board that kicked off the work with family stability. And John and I went along to this sort of very modern office where they were all about 16 as far as you could see. And they were all wearing suit jackets and jeans. I hadn't realised, but this is a sort of uniform of people in very hip jobs. And John and I were, I don't know, I speak for myself here, I began to have a sort of bit of a headache, and I found the whole thing rather complicated. And when we had different coloured post-it notes, and you had to go and stick your post-it. However, it worked rather well. And they got us to concentrate on what it was we wanted to do, how we thought it might be done, the sort of people we wanted to talk to, the sort of ways we wanted to talk to them in, and I mean almost, the colours. Oh no, we did. We discussed the colours the adverts should have and the sort of typography. They were very keen on typography. And we came out of that, and this was quite an expensive process. We came out of it, though, having learned a huge amount of how you do this. And this is not something that all social campaigns can do. But on this occasion, by dint of having a very generous single person who was giving the finances for this, a donor, and he was very engaged with this and had people on his staff come and engage with it too. And we just tried to say, well, we know roughly how you can start one of these things. We know who you ought to go and see roughly. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see many ways in which you could have done it differently or done it better. But nevertheless, you have to start somewhere, and this is how we started. Now it's now a separate charity, and Catherine will be talking about it later on, and I think has huge potential in the future. We had to persuade him, though, that he said he wanted to start a movement, and we had to persuade him that it wasn't probably a movement for family stability. And we had to tell him that it wasn't really in his gift to start a movement. You can run a campaign, or 2 campaigns, or 10 campaigns. You can do all sorts of things in the modern world, but a movement is really when other people think you've started one. When they say to you, oh, look, there's a bit of a movement going on here, then you probably are in movement territory. But if you say you're starting a movement, people will, broadly speaking, ignore you. And again, you're in slightly dangerous territory, over-enthusiasm. So we knew where we wanted to start. We knew where we wanted to make our stand. We had enormous help with branding and messaging. We learnt this wonderful word, the elevator pitch. If you don't know what an elevator pitch is, ask me later, I can tell you. But it's what you say to someone in the elevator. They say, what are you doing? And you've got 6 floors. And the judge, Paul Coleridge, he learnt the elevator pitch for the Family Stability Network. And so people would go up to him and say, what are you doing, Sir Paul? You'd say, oh, I'm helping to start a Family Stability Network. By the way, the Family Stability Network exists for, and he then sort of read it, and he's very good at mirroring. He read this stuff out of his head, and everyone went, that's interesting. Michael Oglesby, the man who paid for it, said one day he came down from Manchester, he said, I was on the train today, Michael, for the very first time, one of my friends, almost certainly in first class, said to me, what are you doing, Michael? And I remembered the elevator pitch, and for the first time I could tell him what I was doing. Indeed, for the first time I knew what I was doing, he said. Oh, that's very good. So these tricks, which of course come out of commerce, These come out of commerce. This is what business has been doing. This is why over half the advertising spend in the country now goes online rather than on TV or in the newspapers. And the first time Paul and I saw this, we were in a room like a trading floor with about 40 people. The average age here was about 18. And they were all staring at screens. And they were working that day for British Airways. And there'd been an overnight flight up from Joburg, the red-eye special, and it had particularly comfy seats in the business class. And I mean, how many people go on a big plane from Johannesburg in the middle of the night? 40 in business class at the most. But there were about 100 people in the room, and they were all pretending they'd been on the red-eye. And so they were all working different social networks saying, had a wonderful time on the flight last night, absolute super leg room, food excellent, you know. And they were building up little networks, and every now and then one or two of them got a lead, and then the others would all pile in and start opening new Facebook accounts in order to... I mean, the boys out there, the commercial boys, are doing this all the time. They're doing it for chocolate, they're doing it for politicians, they're doing it... And in a sense, Paul and I thought, well, can we learn the techniques here and help us in the cause that we have? And this is the way, in a sense, we've started to do it. But I know very little about how it's gone since then. So this is an example then. We're now going to talk about networks. So if you've got a clear idea of what you're doing and how you want to do it, where you want to meet people, then the most important thing we've done over the years is build networks. Keep Sunday Special is the sort of archetypal network. But when we did the Marriage Foundation, we launched it on, that's the judge on the left, Paul Coleridge. We launched it on his home turf. We got the chief rabbi of the day to come and launch it for us. We got a tremendous collection of the great and good, particularly legal figures, and some of the other organisations with which we work, and some we didn't know. We were particularly trying to get the black evangelical churches in London to come, and we didn't really break through. We keep trying to tap into that audience for these sort of occasions. And Nims Abungi came, but otherwise none of them did. But that's something we really need to improve on. And we thought we had the people who were going to finance the operation there at the same time. But it didn't work. They didn't have any idea of what giving. They didn't have the Christian giving until it hurts mentality. They thought, you know, if I give something to the lifeboats or to the children's, it's about £40 a year. And so at the best they would send us that. And so that has not worked as a funding model. But it was the right way to start a network. We also, over the years, have done other sorts of networks. For years, we organised a relationship education conference, in this case with a man from 2 into 1, and the doyen of academic researchers into this sort of thing came from Denver in order to talk to the group we gathered. And this contains all sorts of people like Relate and all the big relationships organisations in the country, some of whom are clients of government, some of whom are religious charities, and there's a big Catholic marriage charity, and there's an Anglican one based at HTB in London, and we did well with that, and really it's been superseded now by other things that we do, but we still in a sense have a brand there which we can come back to from time to time. So this is a small network, a tight network, and then you have a broader network. That's how we do it. And these are some of the people we worked with last year. There's a trade union, there's a part of a university, a co-op, that's the company, 2 into 1, which is a charitable organisation for couples, family. You can see the sort of people that we work with and whom we have a position with, who in a sense know us and trust us. Now, having said that, I think we now need to come to the art of the possible. And this is a political phrase, of course. And you have to know in politics, if you're going to try and use the politicians in the top-down nexus, then you've got to know who your specialist allies are, and you've got to be thunderingly realistic about how you use them. This is the key to this. And you have to be very clear as to where power lies in a system or the system at any time. My father was a senior civil servant, and as we used to drive home sometimes from London, he would go past the House of Commons where there's a light on at night. When it's dark, there's a light showing the House of Commons is still sitting. And he would sort of look out of the car and see the light, say, good, that'll keep them out of mischief. And off we went. And in a sense, that is the civil service attitude, the administration attitude, you know. You've got to keep Parliament out of mischief, you've got to give them things to do. And in this generation, that really has meant increasing the ability they have to spend money on offices or at Westminster. So you can have 2 research assistants on a sort of American model. You're beginning to build a sort of personal cabinet almost, you know. And what this has meant really is it's cut the MPs off from the levers and buttons of power rather than got them closer to it. And people who write papers or send press releases or try and talk to MPs or try and engage them, broadly speaking, are onto a loser. The House of Commons delivers tons of mail to people endlessly sending 630 or whatever it is, bits of correspondence to every single member. We used to weigh the correspondence sometimes, and many kilos of mail would come in the course of the week. I mean, vast piles of stuff, which you couldn't possibly read, you couldn't possibly deal with. And so the most important thing really is to build up a relationship with the MPs independently. This is very difficult to do, but in the course of the years we have, and this is a pamphlet that John wrote entirely. It had interviews. We had people come and give evidence to a committee, of which those 4 MPs were at the heart, but others were interested too. Then John wrote the recommendations. I'm not even sure if he met all of them afterwards, but they all saw it and they were all happy to put their name to it. It was then published. It was very much a niche operation. We knew that if anything, it might affect the internal policy making process of the Conservative Party. It wouldn't have any effect in Parliament at that stage. It was designed for a very specific objective. In a sense, we'd hoped to have it cross-party and to have it a bigger, but it didn't work like that, so we restricted ourselves to that. But it was a better thing to do than to go to the party's policy board and give them a paper. It was a better thing to do than to go to the regional areas where you are supposed to discuss policy with the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. It was a better thing to do than to do what they invite you to do, which is to keep you out of mischief, to keep them out of mischief too. And so this was carefully designed and has had some effect. I mean, and it has been read, and we don't produce nearly as many pamphlets now as we used to, but this was a good one, and we hope to do it again. But we also did the family test, and this we did with the Department of Work and Pensions when Ian Duncan Smith was Secretary of State, which helped. David Cameron was quite keen on this. He made speeches on family from time to time. The family test was supposed to be a test of policy. After 1 year, we, with Relate and the Family and Childcare Trust, did a report saying it wasn't working nearly as well as we'd hoped it would. And this is another interesting thing about these sort of combinations, these sort of networks, is that family, well, certainly Relate take a lot of government money, so they have to be reasonably careful as to what they said. Family and Childcare Trust, I suspect, do. Yes, they do. They do have government money. So they had to be as well, but in a different way. So when we published this, it was reasonably anodyne, reasonably not unfriendly. But when we were asked for comments on it, we could be extremely rude. We don't know they're not our masters of the government. We said, well, it's absolutely disgraceful. And we are outraged in the way that this hasn't worked, you know. Whereas Relate was saying, well, we do understand it's very difficult, but I do hope they could just try a little harder if it's possible, you know. And so, again, if you've got a lot of people in the room, you can react in lots of different ways, and that always confuses the people at the other end of the process. John Ashcroft has one other word on this, which I stole from him yesterday, in terms of the art of the possible and dealing with politicians or rest of it. He said, never trust a government. And I think that's a good point. The governments have their own agendas. We thought we could talk them out of the Keep Sunday special. We thought we could shame them out of it. We thought we could win on the floor, which indeed we did in the end, but they didn't believe us. We followed their rules. They said, we want evidence based. We want you to do, you know, a survey of the economics. We want you to do a family. We did all that. It cost a lot of money. It cost somebody else a lot of money. But we did absolutely everything we were being asked to do. We got everyone to write into the consultation exercise, and they'd never published the figures, but there were 6,000 replies. Well, how many of them were for? And my guess was about 200 or something. Because, you know, the people in shops don't tend to write in, but people who work in shops did, and people who were in the churches and the networks we operated did as well. But they wouldn't even publish this. So they just cheat and bend the rules all the time. That's just the way governments work, and you shouldn't get uppity about it. But thank you, John. Never trust a government. The press. Now, this in a sense is the most obvious thing to do, but you are restricting yourself to very particular audiences if you do this. We're very good with the Marriage Foundation in particular, as you can see, gets into all sorts of different publications. There is Paul now having made a film for the BBC, the Victoria Derbyshire show, a morning show. It's the only time I ever watched it, but I did watch it, and it's really rather good, actually, and there was lots of people chatting away, and he made a quarter-of-an-hour film. They paid for all this, and then he was in the studio later with a couple of people who were meant to be opposing him, but actually they rather liked it. They liked the film, and they all said, yes, this is very interesting. So it worked extremely well, but 5 years ago when we started, the BBC would not have had anyone commenting on marriage on the TV. I mean, maybe there's a change in the general, weather in the country. It's just easier anyway. I think that probably is true. But and the recession has something to do with this, and a lot of people have gone back to their families. It's quite an interesting business. But on the other hand, having established the factual basis for the case, and that on the left is what that is the top 10 facts on marriage down the left, and then on the right are the things that you can deduce from this. And I mean, the one I always quote is that a child born today has only a 50-50 chance, any child born today has only a 50-50 chance of being with both its birth parents by its 15th birthday. Okay? And that is just a fact. And the truth is, at the moment, it's 45% chance, but the figures are going so radically north that it'll be well over 50% by the time they're 15, unless something really extraordinary happens in the meantime. But of those people, of the 50% who are with both their birth parents in 15 years' time, 90-something% will be with a married couple. And it's like, Albanian or communist elections. It's embarrassing to say anything's in the 90% because it sounds automatically sort of implausible. But the figures are very clear about this, that almost all families which survive with children for 15 years will be with children, will be married couples. And of course, an awful lot of people don't get married, so you don't, an awful lot of people are single families or other people like that. But what this really tells you is the instability of living together. I mean, this isn't a moral judgment at all, but just factually, it is an unstable form of bringing up children. Yes, of course.
Number 5 here really intrigued me, I saw this first time, was that it's becoming like an upper class institution.
Yeah, well, this is a very important piece of research that we did. This is Harry Benson who did the research on this. There's this big marriage gap. This is what Tim Montgomery is very interested in, and Fraser Nelson at The Spectator. They're both very interested in this as well. And what in fact has happened is that, although the rates of marriage have dropped, they haven't really dropped for the middle classes. And let's just use that word. It's not precise and it has historical loading, but. So if you've got a stake in society and you've got some income behind you, you are likely to be a much better bet in the marriage stakes. And so the people who get married and who stay married tend to be the wealthier people. The poorer people who used to marry at exactly the same level as the richer people, they don't. And that's where it's dropped off. And David Lammy, when who was the MP in Tottenham, when the riots were on, some poor innocent TV reporter said to him, why are all these children allowed to run around the streets setting fire to people? What do their fathers do? And David Lammy just said, for heaven's sake, there hasn't been a father on this estate, this is an estate of 3,000 people, for 20 years. And he didn't quite mean it, but it was the right point. These are not families as, polite people understand them. But a generation earlier would have been totally different, because the marriage was doing the same thing as it has always done and is doing for people with a greater stake in society now. And that, in a sense, is the figure that we really want to concentrate on most in the coming years with the Marriage Foundation. What can be done about that? And there are all sorts of different ways in which we think we can approach this, but we have a project with the Legatum Institute. That's what the project with the Legatum Institute is about, is to see how we can do this. And also, we have a residential conference next year at the Ditchley Foundation in the country. The government often uses these people in order to sit down, we hope, with an international audience, because a very similar pattern is to be seen in the United States and in Australia and places where we have friends. Also in Qatar, very interestingly, as they've become wealthier, they've gone into exactly the same sort of problems that we have. So working with the press, making it easy, making it straightforward, dishing out the press releases in a way, and this is just easy stuff, but doing it, and then working on relationships with the journalists. And we know, half of those people We are slightly stuck in a silo in that we can get almost anything into the Daily Mail, or the Telegraph is good, the Times occasionally. We've never, it says The Independent because I was so proud of that. We hardly ever get into The Independent. The Guardian occasionally has us, but usually rather suspiciously. The Sun and the Mirror and the Star, the places we like to go, and there was a terrible sadness here because some of Catherine's work was due to go into the Sun just recently, and you have to be realistic about this. It was the day that a block of flats in London caught fire, and instead of getting a tremendous amount of publicity, they cleared 8 pages, and understandably, and we didn't get a second chance at that. And so, I mean, you have to be realistic that you lose some of your very best work gets lost like this. You just have to keep going. And Paul tells a story about meeting a journalist who says, "You're always deluging me with material." And Paul took this as a great compliment. And I think it is. You just need to keep going. I'm sorry, I wasn't.
My question was regarding press and media. Have you had any experience when there's actually corruption in media that's portraying the story differently, or actually
When they're misrepresenting you?
When they're misrepresenting you, or when there's actually legitimate, like the media is not trustworthy, so to speak. How do you know?
No, I'm not sure if I mean, that happens in politics. I can think of that happens very easily in politics, that a press release from one party will be completely and deliberately misunderstood by others. Yes, the Daily Mirror puts the worst possible spin on absolutely anything to do with the Conservative government and the best possible spin on anything that happens to a Labour government. But people who read the Daily Mirror like that, and they sort of know. And you can sort of work round that. The Guardian's much a law of itself, which is why occasionally we can get a hearing in The Guardian, because they think, well, it'll be a bit radical to just stick up for marriage just for once, So you can do that. But broadly speaking, that hasn't been a problem. The hostility we had with the marriage issue, with the legislation on homosexual marriage, when we had to be extremely careful, because they had a press unit which quizzed and investigated material you produced. Now, we kept out of this argument, as I said, but if we said something really quite harmless, they would come crashing in, and John was really good at this because he talked to them really patiently and sensibly. And he said, well, no, this is not what the figures show, and you need to look at this paper or that paper or whatever it was. And so we managed to keep out of difficulties, but a lot of people didn't, because there was a very hostile agenda there. And so I was glad we kept out of that. And we kept out of it, as I say, deliberately. Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, linked to the same-sex issue was that she was misrepresented by the Times in the last.
Yeah.
Which then got recycled on BBC Online.
Yeah. And
so it wasn't a corrupt issue, but in terms of misreporting issue.
Yeah. And it's a really important point about brand management, is you must be fierce in defending your brand. You must be jealous for your brand, and you must do your best. You must stick up for it and fight for it. You mustn't let people try and wear you away at sort of brand level just by saying these people are all nutters. You have to do what politicians do. You have to respond in many circumstances. But press management, I mean, we all understand to a certain extent. But I'll just give you one last example of this: the Family Failure Index, which is quite often quoted and has been quoted all over the world. In Australia and other parts of the world, I often see it quoted. The thing about it is, we just made this up one day. We said there must be a cost of family failure. Other people had a go at it, so we invented a complicated system, which is really too complicated to go on with much longer. But it was a complicated system saying what costs fall to the taxpayer, fall to the state, which a generation ago would have been absorbed by families. What is the cost to the taxpayer of this? And then we made some assumptions, and it doesn't bear too close scrutiny. Nobody has ever scrutinised it too closely, thank heavens. And somebody once suggested they might. They went to the department saying this is monstrous, and the department told me later, they said, well, broadly speaking, we think it's roughly right. And I think that's what people think. They think instinctively, this is the defence budget or something. It's roughly the sort of money that we pay because families no longer look after their children or their old people, or law and order issues, school issues, all sorts of issues right across the board, housing issues, all those things. So this is what it kind of, as long as the taxpayer is prepared to pay £50 billion a year, which used to fall to families, then the system in a sense could go on indefinitely. We rather suspect it will not. At a time, you do not want to think of populist politics like this, but a time could come when, this would be a real problem, people would say. So we're quite sensitive about it, but we show roughly what it costs people not to support families. Just 2 more minutes?
Yeah, 2 more minutes, Michael, and then we'll have some
I
question
promise.
time.
Of course.
Yeah.
Then we go on from that to more modern means of communication, and this is Catherine's field. So you go from that thought board, which we started with, and it comes down to something really nice and simple and straightforward and clever as that. And this is the status campaign. I think the left is the right Facebook and the left, I don't know. But these are all online manifestations of this campaign, which you'll speak more about. We're told that the posts reach 300,000 people a month. I mean, you have to be quite careful about these figures as to how many people are really engaged and all the rest of it. But putting our toe in the water and throwing ourselves in at the deep end in the cold, actually, we've learned a huge amount about how you should do this, but all of you are younger than me, and all of you will know how to do it better than me, so I'm just not going to go there. Let me finish, though, with Relational Schools, which is the last organisation which we've taken on, and again, which we would like to get out into the world on its own. We've set a target of 18 months, who knows. Rob has in the prospectus for this course, it spoke about 3 categories of social reform, and they were about the legislative process, about changing people's values culturally, and this is what we've talked about so far, but also to engage with the middle level institutions like schools and companies to try and change their modus operandi and the bottom line so they're defined more by relational priorities. And that's what Rob, who is the man giving a TED talk second down, is doing. He, again, you start with inspired leadership. If you hear him talk, you'll know that his passion and his leadership qualities are very, very evident. He does the talks, he makes videos, he makes short trailers of the videos. He's just done another one, which we're going to launch in House Commons quite soon. So there's a mixture of traditional communications techniques and modern ones. There's a lot of work we can do with him online in social media and stuff, which we haven't quite got to yet. He used to do it when he started, but he just got too busy growing, as it were, the business. But he somehow encapsulates all the things which we're talking about. And in summary, in building a network to change the world, he and we establish alliances and communities of shared interest. We do both top-down and bottom-up. We're always very broad. We're always practical. We always show how these things can work. We need clarity in the content and in the presentation. We build up both a core network of our closest friends and broad alliances out in the world. We know our specialist audiences, particularly in the parliamentary and political sphere and in the press. We engage in a way with the press which they find useful, so we dish up stories, we put out reports, which really we're doing just to catch their eye. I mean, we're not as bad as some people, but if you want to be on the Today programme, you've really got to have a report published today by the Relationships Foundation says, and then, you're home and dry, and you get a few minutes, but you have to do it well. And it's fine to think of you and it's fun to think of yourself as a brand if you want to, and we didn't used to, but we do now, and it's very similar to how we've always thought of ourselves. Its reputation is very important in this. So, with the corollary that we're now learning how to meet people in social media, and a lot of the smaller charities which we know are watching it very closely because we have the financial ability to be part of a project that's doing this, and many of them don't, but they want to know if there's a cheap and cheerful way of doing this, and I suspect there is. I suspect it's one of the spin-offs of the work which will be really important for other people in this. So finally, the last thing I want to say is if it seems to be taking a lot of time, that's just fine. These things do take a lot of time. Sometimes they come alive very quickly. Sometimes some of these social media campaigns, not ours, but other ones come alive very quickly, and then they die down very quickly. But if you want to make long-term progress, it will take time. And if you can think your way back to the 5 gentlemen who were at the heart of abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire and playing a key role in abolishing it throughout the world through the power of the Navy and other institutions of the time, then they plugged away at it for a very long time. Wilberforce had his flash moment of conversion in the late 18th century. He took up the cause of anti-slavery in 1787, and the legislation, which actually the decisive legislation, came in 1833, just a few weeks before he died. 46 years after he'd started, and much more after other people had started. So you shouldn't be worried about this. These things do take time, but they can make a huge difference, and we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think they could, and we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't think these were core issues of our time. So, questions are welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Seminars are going to start very soon, but I think we'll have time for one question. Is there anybody? Rachel.
Hard luck, Rachel.
Hi, I'm really keen to get your perspective on something, kind of off the back of something said to Mercedes when she asked about corruption in the media, and said you thought it was more likely to be seen in the political world. And I'd just be keen to hear whether you...
Well, I can't think of what she means. I'm sorry, I mean, that's not helpful. That's not helpful, but I'm not quite sure what corrupt media does. I mean...
But more with politics, do you think that British politics has problems with corruption risk and corruption? Is that something you
Internal...
during your career or think?
I think the British political system is probably as free of corruption as you can possibly get, and I say that with some humility, and that I myself, my own career, fell foul of this, and I know that. But the idea that you can influence contracts, either at local or national or local government, by knowing people, I mean, most politicians go out of their way not to help friends or, immigration cases or whatever. And I was saying to someone the other day, they had an immigration case. I think if you weigh in as an MP, if you do it properly and present the case in the right way, then it'll be treated with respect. But if you go and talk to the minister in private, the minister will probably never speak to you again, because the system is very, very tight on this. The press will always be, they are political, we're all political, and the press will behave politically, but I'm still not quite sure what a corrupt media is. It's my fault.
Perhaps it doesn't apply so much in the British context, but I know in other nations, for example, media companies...
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I've worked overseas in elections. I did election monitoring for a long time, and in Kyrgyzstan and places like that. I mean, with with the IRI from Washington. And yes, you're right. No, of course. And in Ukraine, I did 3 elections in Ukraine. The media was deeply corrupt and was buyable and was part of the institutional bias usually towards the government, and the government had appointed most of these people. Yes, no, of course that does happen. Yes, no, I understand. But I think it's quite, I mean, Mr. Murdoch here will have an agenda. There's just no doubt about it. But you don't have to read his papers. And people, by and large, and people who read, I don't never quite understand why anyone reads the Daily Mail, but people who do read the Daily Mail find it very comforting, and that's their worldview. And I worked for the Telegraph for a while. I wrote the leaders, and I was deeply aware that if you wrote something that the readers, broadly speaking, didn't want to hear, sales would go down. How do you respond to an incident in the world? Well, you think, what would the readers think? And then you thought, well, can we wear that? Yes, we probably can. And that's how it's done. So there's a symbiotic relationship with the reader, not usually with the owner, and certainly not with the government. Governments, again, bend over backwards not to be seen as if they're paying, as they're trying to control the press. But I know it's different in lots of other parts of the world. But in a sense, the problem for younger people, the problem in putting together campaigns in the future, the problem in communicating in the future, will be that you have to do it in a very different way. And you're not so worried about the press or about government. You've got to somehow learn how to control the ether or make the ether work for you in such a way that you can do the same sort of work, have the same sort of effect, but in a very, very radically different way. I don't know, I wish you luck. I mean, it's full of possibilities as well as lots of pitfalls. And it's sure to get cheaper.
Yes.